doctor Rajendra Pachauri. La verdad es, I know you for a long time. No, it's just a matter of natural choice. La verdad es, many years ago, you were a lady, and you made us an invitation to visit the house. There were many people there. We had a nice visit with Rajendra Pachauri, only in Delhi, and it was a memorable occasion. Well, and for us it's very nice, and we are very honored to have you here. Whatever the ways that brought you here, we are very grateful to those ways. Probably Antonio can clear that for us, but we are very happy to have you here. And remind the people here that you were the president of the IPCC for a very long time. There was a very fruitful period. I think that I don't know how to put it, because in some respects the worries of not so fortunate countries were in somehow better represented there, or at least they had some sort of representation that previously have none. And I think that well, I hope for the IPCC that recovers some of that genuine preoccupation for what happens in other areas of the planet, less important. And well, this is in the discourse of the IPCC, and it's been in the discourse for a long time about the regional studies, and trying to somehow get to formulate some things that can be done to alleviate the problems and get us in a better shape to face climate change. Me disculpe, por un momento me despisté y les hablé en inglés, pero les puedo hablar en pocho o en Spanglish. Bueno, si no me entendieron, levanten la mano y les puedo hacer un resumen, así no se sientan mal. Realmente hice un reconocimiento de la labor del doctor Pachauri como presidente del IPCC, de que fue una época, pues yo creo que muy buena para el IPCC, donde hubo una especie como de, ¿cómo lo podría decir? El tercer mundo que domina este planeta, digamos, o los países en vías de desarrollo y menos desarrollados, que son la inmensa mayoría de este planeta, de alguna forma estaban más presentes en lo que hacíamos, en lo que se hacía del IPCC. Espero, como dije, en relación a lo que le dediqué al doctor Pachauri, que ocurriera en estos momentos también con la nueva presidencia del IPCC. Realmente esta cosa, un poco preocupación por el desarrollo, preocupación por estas cosas que se sigan manifestando. No es posible hacer lo que tendríamos que hacer si no hubiera flujos de conocimiento y de recursos realmente de una región del planeta a otra, para que podamos hacer y adaptarnos, por ejemplo, adaptarnos al cambio climático y desarrollar las energías que necesitamos desarrollar para también estarnos enfrentando a las causas del cambio. Entonces, el doctor Pachauri, es para nosotros un gusto tenerlo aquí. We are around here, and it's going to and well, this is your body.
Gracias. Let me say it's a great privilege to be in this remarkable institution. And I was just mentioning while we were driving up here that I really can't think of a bigger institution than this anywhere in the world. And I'm sure this is the largest university, not only in terms of the area that you occupy, but also the number of students and faculty that you have. And the good thing is that this is an institution that has not lost quality. If anything, it combines quality with quantity, which makes it absolutely unique. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm going to make a presentation before you which derives essentially from the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, and I have distinguished colleagues over here who contributed to the fifth assessment report, and I'm very grateful to Carlos for the good words that he's spoken. Yes, when I was chair of the IPCC for 13 years, and a lot of people feel I was there much too long, and they still feel that I shouldn't be around, even without my association with the IPCC. But I was, of course, very sensitive to the problems of the least developed countries, the developing countries in general, because we really have to be very sensitive to the differential in terms of impacts of climate change on different parts of the world. And there are some who are far less privileged than others, and we need to be concerned about them. Science, of course, cannot be compromised with politics, but science certainly can be prioritized to look at the entire picture rather than a very small section of humanity. So let me go to the next slide. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which, as you know, the UN has now accepted, and they are listed over here. The good thing is that a lot of these are interconnected, and of course, as you can see, we have climate action, which is goal number 13, and you can't see climate action in isolation of everything else, because these are all interconnected and in some form or the other have major implications for the climate of this planet and what we are going to be able to do to deal with that problem of climate change. So I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that when we look at the issue of climate change and what we need to do in order to deal with this challenge, we have to look at a much larger picture, because climate change cannot be seen in isolation of all these other goals which are part of sustainable development. Next slide. The IPCC fifth assessment report has some key challenges. The first is that human influence on the climate system is clear, and I think there's no cause for doubt on that at all. And we also know that the more we disrupt our climate, the more we risk severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts, including some abrupt and irreversible impacts. And the abrupt impacts are something that you really can't predict in terms of timing, in terms of the thresholds that are going to trigger those impacts. But when they come, since they are abrupt, we would really not be in a position to deal with them. So I think human nature, which really should minimize risks, should ensure that we take action in such a way that we don't risk the possibility of these abrupt and irreversible changes. Fortunately, we have the means to limit climate change and build a more prosperous and sustainable future. Because if we can tackle the challenge of climate change, we would also, to a large part, be tackling the challenge of sustainable development. And therefore, if we want a sustainable future, particularly for the youth of today and those who are going to come after them, we have to be very conscious of the need to create a sustainable and prosperous future. Next. If you look at this statement is very significant. It says it is extremely likely that we are the dominant cause of warming since the mid-20th century. And when the IPCC uses the term extremely likely, it represents a probability of over 95%. In the previous report, the fourth assessment report, we used the term very likely, because at that stage, the probability that we associated with this statement was about 90%. And that is captured by the term very likely. But now we are absolutely sure, so frankly 95% is pretty close to 100%. And therefore, there should be no reason for doubt at all. And if you look at the average temperature, the way it's changed since the beginning of industrialization, you can see it was reasonably steady, and in fact even went down in the early part of the last century. But over the last 60 years or so, you see a very rapid increase in the trend. To be quite honest, is very worrisome, because this clearly represents a sort of runaway global warming or increase in temperature, which has very major implications and impacts all over. Next. And you know, a lot of people will say that there is a hiatus, that there is a halt in climate change. But if you look at the average per decade, what is stated up here is extremely significant. It says each of the past 3 decades has been successively warmer than the preceding decade since 1850. So you can imagine, since 1850, every single decade has been warmer than the previous decade. And what really happened is in 1998, there was a very serious El Nino phenomenon, as a result of which we had very high temperatures. And if you take that one single year, you might say temperatures after that have been lower and not rising as fast as that particular point. But you know, that was, one might call, a very unusual year, and you can't use that as the data. You can't use that as the base for determining what happened later. So I just want to emphasize the fact that climate change is continuing. It has not slowed. If anything, it is becoming far more serious. Next. And we need to be very concerned about what we are doing, not only to land surfaces, but also the ocean. Because more than 90% of the energy accumulating in the climate system between 71 to 2010, these 40 years, has actually accumulated in the ocean. So, you know, in some sense, the oceans have absorbed a large part of the sins that we have been imposing on planet Earth. And land temperatures, of course, remain at historic highs, while ocean temperatures continue to climb. And we have estimated in the fifth assessment report that up to a depth of 700 meters, the oceans have warmed substantially. And now that heat is going much lower. So you can imagine what that does to all the ecosystems in the marine areas and what it does to marine life. And in several parts of the world, marine life has migrated to areas where, of course, the climate is not as warm as it is where they have been native. So there is a shift, particularly in fish stocks, in all kinds of marine species, which has major implications. And of course, the damage to some of the marine ecosystems is something to be concerned about. Coral reefs, Great Barrier Reef, there's a report just last week that says that it's completely destroyed. The Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia is one of the ecological treasures of this planet, and that obviously has been destroyed as a result of climate change. Next. If you look at sea level change, that is also accelerating, and since the beginning of the last century up to 2010, the increase has been an average of 19 centimeters. Now I might mention that this is only an average figure. There are some areas where sea level rise has been higher, some areas where it's been a little lower. And what this should also be seen in the context of is extreme events. You know, when you have extreme sea level or sea related events like coastal flooding or storm surges, if the level of the sea is higher, then the extent of damage from those events will also be much higher. And therefore, it's not only enough to look at average values, but what that implies in terms of occurrences where the sea level is a major factor in the impacts that we will have and the damage that it's going to cause. Next. If you look at the fact that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came into existence essentially in 1992. So So a quarter century has gone by. And you would have expected that human society would have exercised its responsibility to this generation, to coming generations, and to all the ecosystems of this planet. But I'm not too sure it will come. Because look at the increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. The uppermost line is carbon dioxide. And you see how rapidly it's increased. And below that is methane, and the lowest, of course, is N2O, nitrous oxide. So clearly, whatever we did in the year 1992 has not affected our behavior or our activities. And therefore, we have a long way to go if we really want to deal with this major challenge and growing challenge of climate change. Next. And the sources of emissions, as you can see, the dark shaded area represents the burning of fossil fuels, cement and flaring, and the yellow area is forestry and other land use. Because as a result of deforestation, obviously you're increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Trees, of course, absorb carbon dioxide, and if you remove them, then the balance is upset and you have more carbon dioxide. But look at the huge increase as far as the first of these particular drivers is concerned. Fossil fuel, cement, and flaring. This morning we had a series of talks, including by His Excellency the Secretary of Energy, and there was also a pointed reference to the fact that fossil fuels, oil for instance, will remain over the next 50 years. But that's no reason why we should continue using it. I might say, many years ago, I had the questionable privilege of an award to Sheikh Yamani, who some of you might remember was the oil minister of Cambio when the first oil price shock took place. And he's supposed to have made a comment. He didn't realize the implication of it for oil. He said the Stone Age didn't end because there were no stones, right? But similarly, I think the fossil fuel age can easily end, even though you have a lot of fossil fuels lying around. And I think it's time that we need to think of what we are doing to this planet and all the species that live on it, and take decisions based on the welfare of all living species rather than the welfare of those who have resources in terms of fossil fuels. So this is a point which needs to be made. When you talk about this, of course, you don't make it as popular with some sections of society. But then, if you want to tell the truth, you can't be in the popularity context. Next. Sources of emissions, 35% come from the energy sector, 24%, which is a pretty large amount, from agriculture, forests, and other land uses, 21% from industry, 14% from transport, and 6.4% from buildings. That is the activity of buildings, not the use of it. The use of buildings give you much higher emissions than what is indicated in here. So I really think if we want to reduce emissions, we have to focus on all these sources, and each one of them has enormous potential for reduction. And in many cases, the reduction can take place at zero cost or even negative cost. So you might ask, why is it not happening? Simply because there's a huge amount of inertia in the system. See, we have, if you look at buildings, I mean, buildings last a long time, and once you have a pattern of energy use, you're more or less locked in. Yes, you can bring about some improvements, but these are limited. And therefore, we have the inertia in infrastructure, we have the inertia in processes and technologies, and most importantly, we have inertia up here in people's minds. And you don't want to change. There is a resistance to change, and you want to believe that, going on the path that you're on is the best path. I remember I had a chemistry teacher who would always say, get off the beaten path. And I think that was very wise counsel, because anyone who continues on a path that has been established, well, you could be like Al Gore often gives this example of a frog in a pot of water which is gradually warming, and the frog will stay there till it dies. Of course, if you throw a frog into hot water, it will jump out. But if it's a gradual and process increase in temperature, the guy can't figure it out. And I think that's to a large extent the attitude of human beings also. We have a lot in common with frogs. I personally do, because when I was 6 years old, I won a race which was called the frog race. And the little kids had to jump like frogs and go from one to the other. And that's one of my proudest moments. I did very well as a frog. I'm not too sure if I've done very well. Next. Some of the changes in extreme weather and climate events observed since about 1950 have been taken. So, climate change is not a situation where, the frog is in a pot of water and it's gradually warming. You're going to have a lot of extreme weather. We are seeing a lot of extreme weather. And the trend is absolutely clear. There's an increase in extreme precipitation events, an increase in heat waves, an increase possibly in hurricanes. I mean, the jury is still out, but the evidence seems to be pointing to the direction. Today I read a very interesting article about how climate change could also be triggering earthquakes. And I won't get into that, but it's interesting that people are trying to draw that link. And what they are saying basically is that, the areas which are earthquake prone are so delicately balanced that anything which sort of tips that balance can trigger an earthquake. It's very interesting. I'll certainly send you that link to Antonio, because he keeps educating me, sending me all kinds of material. Now I can do something in reverse. Okay, next. Impacts are taking place from the tropics to the poles, from all the continents and in the ocean. I once had this unique opportunity to go to Greenland, and we went on a US Air Force plane, and it landed not on wheels, it landed on skis. And that aircraft couldn't take off after it had dropped us off over there. There's a research station where, of course, temperatures go down to -30, -40 degrees. When we went, it was pretty bad. Anyway, people work over there and they're doing outstanding scientific research. But when you look at that huge body of ice, it's 3 kilometers high. And Greenland, as you know, is the largest island in the world after Australia, which is a continent. And these 3-kilometer high mountains of ice that you see, they're so large. And can you imagine if any part of that was to collapse and go into the ocean, as we have clearly projected in the IPCC fifth assessment report? Either that or the Antarctic. If there's any part of that which collapses and goes into the ocean, then you would have sea level rise of several meters. So it's really a global tsunami that's going to hit everyone. And the point I want to make is that we need to be concerned about every corner of the globe. There are problems, there are impacts, and there are concerns related to every part of the globe. And it affects rich and poor countries. Of course, poor countries don't have the infrastructure, don't have the means by which they can really protect themselves. Give you an example. When you get a hurricane hitting Florida, they get ample timely warning. And what do? They board their windows, they get into their pickup trucks or their SUVs and drive off to an area which is safe. What happens when a similar cyclone hits a country like Bangladesh of same intensity? Well, firstly, they don't even get early warning. And even if they do, they can't get away. They're very poor people. And they've got little huts. Their huts get destroyed, their homes are lost, and they don't know what to do. Their livelihoods are also lost. So, the poor, of course, suffer far more. And Carlos mentioned that, I probably showed greater sympathy to those parts of the world while I was chair of the IPCC, but I can tell you, I never neglected any aspect of science to the best of my ability. And it was a very productive experience working with such a remarkable set of scientists. And of course, even dealing with governments. And these governments are very diverse, right from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, to the small island states, who are going to be the worst affected as far as the impacts of climate change are concerned. Next. Continued emissions of GHGs will cause further warming and changes in the climate system. Oceans will continue to warm during the 21st century, and you can imagine what that's going to do to the marine ecosystems and marine life. Of course, it's not only warming of the oceans, but also the acidification of the oceans. Let me give you a number. Since the beginning of industrialization, 30% of the carbon dioxide that's being generated has gone into the oceans. And that has led to a substantial increase in acidification of the oceans. And that has major implications for marine ecosystems and marine life. And to be honest, this is an area which has not been researched enough. And I expect in the next few years, we'll learn much more on what we are doing in what you might call the blue economy. Ice cover in the Arctic Sea is reducing very rapidly. And here again, our projections in the IPCC AR5 are that if we move along the high emission scenario which we are on currently, then by 2050, in September 2050, please mark that date, I'm sure some of you will be around, I will. You will have no Arctic sea ice. The Arctic Ocean will have no ice floating if we remain on the high emissions trajectory that we are on. And global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century. It can go as high as 98 centimeters. And who knows, science might tell us that it will be even worse than that. Global glacier volume will further decrease. So all of this is going to have major implications on water availability, particularly given the fact that precipitation patterns are also changing. And you'll get a lot more heavy precipitation, not spread as it has been in several parts of the world on a much more uniform basis. In fact, we have clearly assessed that even in those parts of the world where there will be a decline in average precipitation, the bulk of it will take place in the form of heavy precipitation, heavy rains, or heavy snowfall. Next. So we could have food and water shortages. The population of the world is increasing. Increased poverty, will have increased poverty, increased displacement of people, much greater coastal flooding. And we've also said that there would be much greater chances of conflict between groups, countries, people in general, because the drivers of conflict will be further exacerbated. So what can we do? If we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees, we need to reduce GHG emissions by about 40 to 70% compared to 2010. And that's not going to happen by itself. We have to start today if we want to reach that goal. And by the end of the century, we'll have to get into the zone of net zero or negative GHG emissions. You see road signs over here in Mexico City, Zona, so and so. I wish we should have signs which say Zona 2100, zero emissions, because that's the zone in which we have to go. Global emissions curve within the next 5 to 15 years, because if we delay this, then we've lost the opportunity of getting on the trajectory which will get us there. Because then you will need very sharp and very sudden reductions which will be beyond the capability of human society. Next. More efficient use of energy, greater use of low carbon and no carbon energy, and many of these technologies exist today. Today the cost of renewable energy, for instance, has come down to a level where it's extremely attractive. And we need improved carbon sinks, That means much greater area under forests, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and most importantly, lifestyle and behavioral changes. And these lifestyle and behavioral changes mean that in our own personal lives, we'll have to use energy far more efficiently, and even what we consume will have to be changed in such a way that we don't have large carbon footprint. And that includes even our dietary preferences. Our diets will have to change in such a way that our carbon footprint comes down substantially. Carbon and water footprint. I mean, in August of this year, National Geographic had a very interesting article on this huge farm in Iowa, which I think has something like 50,000 cattle. And they had estimated the amount of water that's being used over there. And overall, it gave a very startling estimate that a quarter-pound hamburger would require something like 460 gallons of water if you look at the whole size. Now that, to my mind, is frightening. So, lifestyle and behavioral changes are going to be important. If we look at the carbon budget, and this is something that we were able to do for the first time in the fifth assessment report. Let's go back to the period when industrialization started. And at that stage, let us say we had said, okay, we are not going to allow temperature increase to go beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Well, how much can we emit to make sure that we don't go beyond 2 degrees? The budget that we would have estimated would have been 2,900 gigatons of CO2. And by 2011, we had used up 1,900. Today, it's probably somewhere near 2,400. So, you know, the amount that's remaining is very, very small. And if we use up this budget, then clearly we're going to exceed 2 degrees Celsius well before the end of this century. So this is the challenge. And that's precisely why we have to bring about a very sharp reduction in CO2 emissions as quickly as possible. Next. We need all stakeholders on board, governments, businesses, research organizations, certainly institutions like this. And I would say that one can do a lot on a campus like this. I taught at Yale in the year 2000 for one semester. And at that stage, I tried to get the students interested in launching some kind of a sustainability initiative. And there was very little interest. Then I went back in 2009, and for 5 years I was on faculty, and I saw a marked difference. Now that's also because awareness about climate change has improved substantially. So people are now quite prepared to do much more than they had wanted to earlier. And I think a campus like this can do a great deal. The greatest assurance of this 2 degree Celsius limit lies in what we have called the RCP 2.6. So it's essential for global society to constantly evaluate commitments against this RCP 2.6. Really speaking, you need some kind of a monitor. It could be institutions like this and other groups to keep telling the world, look, we are off track, we are not on the right track. And that has to be done as a continuous dynamic exercise. And the irony is that is what every country is committed to do at Paris. Really requires an upping and increasing of the ambition in different societies. Hence, it's very important to raise the level of ambition worldwide. It's only then that we would be able to make sure that we get on to the RCP 2.6 pathway. Next. Now, the ultimate objective of Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic, that means human-induced interference with the climate system. How do you decide what's dangerous and what's not dangerous? The people who are living in Haiti would say, well, climate change is already dangerous. We have lost 1,000 lives. We have lost so much. If you talk to somebody in the Maldives Islands or Kiribati, which is another set of small islands in the Pacific, they will tell you that they're having to abandon some of the islands where people were living earlier. They'll say we've already reached the danger point. So this is something which is very subjective. but I think we need to focus on it. And I think we have to see this within a human life. Human beings, their lives, their welfare and well-being is being threatened, and therefore danger has to be seen in those terms. And the mitigation scenarios reaching about 450 to 500 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, like 2100, have significant co-benefits, because you will get much lower levels of pollution at the local level. You will probably get much higher employment. You will get much higher energy security. You will get much more stable agricultural output. So there are many co-benefits in reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. If you were to evaluate all of those, you would say, my God, we guys are crazy. Why are we not doing this? It's like dollar bills lying on the sidewalk, as the Americans say, and we're not picking them up. Infrastructure and products with long life could lock societies into rigid technologies. I mean, if we build homes which are inefficient in the use of energy, well, you're caught with it for the next 40 or 50 years perhaps, if not longer. And substantial cuts in GHG emissions are required by mid-century through large-scale changes in energy systems. So let's accept the fact that this is not going to be easy, but it's essential. There's no way we can ignore this responsibility. And global CO2 emissions from energy supply sector are required to decline over the next decade by reductions of 90% or more below 2010 levels between the period 2040 and 2070. So the energy sector has to change radically and rather quickly. Next. Okay, well, I've said that already. Then behavior, lifestyle, and culture we talked about. Decarbonization of the electricity generation, or electricity generation, is a key component of mitigation strategies. That means we have to move away from fossil fuel-based electricity generation. And renewable energy technologies are very attractive options with rapid cost reduction. Aggregate economic costs of mitigation vary widely, but if you look at the overall global average, then you get on the RCP 2.6 pathway, which is the best scenario which we ever see. The cost to the global economy is 0.06 of GDP each year, and that's not a hell of a large cost. So, you know, again, it's senseless not to follow that particular approach. Next. Now, I want to tell you about why I believe the Paris Agreement is not going to get us what we want. The Paris Agreement is based on what each country is committed to do itself. And some of the countries will not even meet those commitments. And if you add all of them up, it is nothing compared to what is required. And I think the only way, given the fact that the major countries in the world are democracies, we need to see that there's a people's movement to deal with climate change. And that would require adaptation. It would require very serious mitigation measures. And how do we bring that about? In my view, the only way we can do that is to involve the youth of the world. So I've launched something called the POP movement, and some of our partners in Mexico are here. They can raise their hands so that everybody sees you. Mexico is the first country where we launched this program, and the aim is to mobilize the youth, and I hope on this campus someone will volunteer to say that we are going to start this over here. If you do, I'll embrace you if you permit me. And we can then get something going, and this campus can become a model for other campuses. And we need to achieve sustainable development goals. We need to mitigate climate change. We have to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because some impacts are going to continue. Even if we bring emissions down to zero today, some impacts, because of past momentum of the concentration of greenhouse gases, will continue in the future. Next. And there's a current lack of knowledge, awareness, and inertia to implement climate change solutions. This is the major gap in giving you the kind of action you want. The POP movement will create and serve the massive demand for action that can be implemented in schools, colleges, and communities worldwide, and certainly in a university like this.
And knowledge about climate change solutions will be provided as part of the POP movement. So what we are calling this movement is the POP movement, Youth Inspired by Knowledge. I think if you get inspired by knowledge on what's going to happen if you don't do anything, if you just leave things as they are, and how attractive it is to do what is required, if you have that knowledge, if you are empowered with that knowledge, you will take action. Next. So we are going to mobilize young people globally, and we will promote collective action, especially among youth, to implement solutions. And we would recognize and reward youth-led actions, exemplary initiatives. Those youth who do outstanding work will be recognized as pop stars. Those teachers who do outstanding work will be recognized as pop masters. So this is something that is clearly part of our plan, and I hope we can implement it. Next. These are members of the International Advisory Board of the POP movement. This young lady is 13 years old, and for the last several years, she has made environmental protection her religion. Her brother, who is a year older, and her father are doing remarkable work. This young lady is 21 years old in Australia. She started a movement to get rid of plastics when she was 13 years old. That gentleman is an entrepreneur in India. That's the former chief executive of a global company called DNVGL, very focused on sustainable development. That's an entrepreneur in the US who believes that government is not going to do anything, only people can solve this kind of problem. This gentleman is sitting up here, and he can turn around and show you his face. And then you can see whether his photograph is like this. And this is a lady in France who's a great philanthropist, is doing a lot of work all over the world. So they are our advisors. They are the ones who are giving us guidance in the POP movement. Next. These are global partnerships. Cinema Planeta is represented here. Those two very difficult people sitting over there, very dangerous people, are our partners in Mexico. And of course, we have several others in other parts of the world. Next. This was the launch in Mexico, and this is just a picture of the event that was held on Earth Day, 22nd of April this year. We launched the POP movement. Next. And this is important. You see, we all feel very good when GDP, in India I get very upset. The government is trying to tell us that India is growing at 7.5% per annum. But what are we doing to our rivers? What are we doing to our trees? What are we doing to the filthy, polluted air that we have created? All of that is never counted. There's a very interesting organization in San Francisco called Redefining Progress. And they come up with what they call the genuine progress indicator. And they give you examples of the fact that, first we eat a hell of a lot, okay? So we become fat. All that we eat goes into the GDP of the country. Then when we become fat, we become sick, all right? Then the medical attention you get also goes into the GDP. Then you start going to a gym, and the output of the gym also becomes part of the GDP. And therefore, you ask yourself at the end of the day, is the GDP really giving you a reflection of human welfare? Or is this just fictitious? So, what Gandhi said was absolutely right. Speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. So if you're running in the opposite direction, then what's the point of saying that you're going very fast? But if you come to the streets of New Delhi, you'll find people are driving all over the place. Nobody follows any discipline. There was a driver who applied for a visa in the Canadian embassy. So he was asked, what are you going to do in Canada? He said, I'll drive a truck. He said, but you realize in Canada they drive on the right-hand side of the road. Over here we drive on the left-hand side of the road. He said, look, I drive in the middle of the road over here. I drive in the middle of the road there. So, you can say that you're going in the wrong direction at a hell of a speed, but is that what you really want in life? And Confucius said, if you think in terms of a year, plant a seed.
If in terms of 10 years, plant trees. If in terms of 100 years, teach the people. So if you're really dealing with some of the planetary challenges that we have, the first thing we need to do is to teach the people. Of course, we also have to plant seeds, we also have to plant trees. All of that has to be done. But we cannot neglect education. You need an enlightened society. We're in the 21st century. We're supposed to be the century of knowledge. And if we don't provide knowledge about what we are doing to this planet, then we are only deluding ourselves. We are being totally irresponsible. This generation, the generation that is young, your generation, and the generation yet to come. Muchas gracias.
¿Alguien quiere hacer un comentario?
Dr. Pachauri, you mentioned in your talk about you, a friend of mine, Raúl Delgado, age 16, filed a lawsuit again, supported by more than 3,000 signatures against the city administration of Irapuato, which is the city from which I come from, for removing unlawfully mesquite trees for making way for a 6-lanes highway. The lawsuit was judged last Friday, and Raul's family had to pay a bail for $500, more or less. The city manager ridiculized the measure, meaning that the city was losing far more money and mocking the 3,000 citizens who are against misunderstood urban mobility. What do you think about Raul's course of action?
Well, I would say that what has happened is tragic. I mean, you really need people to stand up. And if you look at any great movement that has taken place over the world, which has proved successful, initially you run into an enormous amount of opposition. So I would say Raul is a pioneer and he should not give up. He should do this again and continue to do this. I misquoted Gandhi this morning, but you know what he said was absolutely right. He said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they fight you, and then you win. So I think Raul will win, and people like him will win. But we have to keep at it. We just can't give up. There is too much at stake, and if he's 16 years old, he really has to worry about the state of this planet in the next many decades. So I would like to compliment someone like that. It's wonderful that we have brave and bright people like that.
Thank you, Doctor.
Here, Emilia, and Hans. Tome números. O sea, ya me tengo que echar el rayo. We need 3 words. No. The last one, and the penultimate.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. As you showed us, climate change needs an integrated approach. And I think one of the major issues here to implement the Paris Agreement is precisely to figure out how to do that, because otherwise co-benefits would be irrelevant if we are not placing that in an integrated fashion, looking at all the sectors involved. Could you tell us an example anywhere in the world where we would be able to learn about a successful case, please? Thank you.
Well, I would say the Nordic countries have done very well. And you find that civil society, governments, and the corporate sector have worked together. And I think that's largely the result of realization and knowledge that we are all in this together. You know, my good friend who was president of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Beyond Dixon, used to say business cannot succeed in a society that fails. So I think we have to somehow get people to realize that we are in this together. And that's not easy to achieve. Some societies have done it much better than others, like in modern societies.
One last comment, a short question.
Yes, a short question. I'd like to congratulate you on your pop movement. It looks to be very interesting. You mentioned that this is the age of knowledge. I think there's so much knowledge available. The issue is much more like how do we communicate to the people about the knowledge that we have. And I would like to ask you, what is your communication plan or strategy as a pop movement?
That's a very good point. In fact, while I was with the IPCC, I can tell you, I was very deeply concerned about the fact that we have not communicated with the outside world. We took some small steps. To be honest, we have a website. We're going to make that much more live. We'll have to use social media, and we have just started. But the point you made is totally valid, because there's no point in harboring knowledge if you're not going to communicate it to the people. And it has to be communicated in a way that they understand and appreciate. If they don't, then it's like just reading a book and reading the slides. So this is really a challenge, and we will try to address this as effectively as possible. I think we leave it there.
Let's have the last, the contra last. The last question. Make a comment. You have the microphone there.
It's not a short idea. It's a very big, complex.
And then talk to him afterwards.
Can I talk to you at the end?
Absolutely.
Yes, it's very, very important. I have a very good idea to reduce the GHG emissions. Yes, thank you.
Well, you can tell us that idea afterwards. It's a good idea.
We'll first patent it together.
First discuss the idea and then we share the idea. You share the idea. Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri. This is so that you can put it into your curriculum vitae. So you were the 6th Congress. This is a book. This is the Mexican IPCC